Today we're talking about a more casual topic, but a question that I quite frequently get. And that is, why are all characters in Smite balanced around Conquest, and why is the game as a whole balanced around Conquest? The examples that are frequently used in this context are Heroes of the Storm, which has multiple maps and still balances characters for all of those maps, and League of Legends, which also has multiple maps and balance changes specifically for those maps. In order to understand this a little better, we need to dig into how these games were designed first. In regards to Heroes of the Storm, the point is that the whole game was, from the start, based on making multiple maps. A lot of different maps, actually. But the maps still generally follow the same structure. They have a decent size, so you can't just rotate from one side to the other very quickly. They have 5 players, they have certain objectives that have to be played around that depend on the map, but in the end the play style in itself doesn't completely change. You won't find anything like an arena where the balance would be similar, or you won't find anything like a joust where you have 3v3. As such, balancing in Heroes of the Storm in itself is a completely different story, and it can kinda be excluded. But if we look into the MOBA segment, we obviously have League of Legends. And League of Legends has balance specifically for one of their game modes, and that is Twisted Treeline. Now, Twisted Treeline has been out for a very long time, and it used to not be the only mode. There's also Aram, All Random, All Mid, which is basically Smite's equivalent of Assault. And there was also Dominion at some point, which was kinda more like a arena style thing, though it was still a bigger map where you had to take over certain objectives and hold those points. And let's look at what happened in League of Legends. Twisted Treeline got a few balance changes specifically for the map. The map is a map that is being played in ranked and as such has a bit of a higher value to the developers, I would assume, and gets their own changes. Aram got changes for the map, but never changes for the champions as far as I'm aware and as far as I can find out. That's because Aram is more considered a casual mode, a fun mode, and doesn't really require the same amount of attention as the main mode as their normal equivalent to Conquest. Dominion never got its own changes either, and Dominion actually did so poorly overall that it was eventually removed from the game. There was only a small fraction of the player base that was actively playing the mode, and so was ditched. Smite, on the other hand, has a lot of modes. We have so many different modes, especially with all those situational modes basically as well, like a mode of the day or the current adventures, that it is almost hard to keep track. A lot of these modes don't have a ranked version, they have just the casual version. For example, Arena, which used to have a ranked mode, but that ended up in people just stagnating until very late game, just last hitting minions and then having one big fight. And then there's, for example, Assault, which is basically Aram and never had any sort of ranked mode to it. And the same applies for Clash. Joust and Duel and Conquest are the ranked modes. Putting this in perspective, you can already see, okay, we have these casual modes in League of Legends that were never balanced at all, and the same probably won't happen in Smite either. I'll explain more about that later. But we have the ranked modes, and, well, based on what we see from other games, we could assume that Smite is being balanced for all ranked modes. The issue is that that's simply not possible. The first mode is 1v1. 1v1 balance would just completely tear apart every other mode if the balance would be changed so it would apply for all modes, because you would suddenly have Guardians that are excellent in the 1v1s and things like that. So that's not gonna happen. We could have specific changes for Duel only, but that would be a massive amount of work for a relatively small player base of people playing Duel. And I don't mean to offend anyone, I play Duel myself sometimes for fun, but it's just not the main mode, the mode that Smite gets promoted with or anything like that. And really, it's not designed for 1v1. 1v1, I think, is more left in the game as a friendly nod to the Duel community that has been playing that mode for a long time, or for people who really don't want to play with other people but still enjoy Smite. And as such, it will probably keep on existing, but I doubt it will ever be considered one of the primary modes. The other mode is 3v3 Joust. Now, Joust is played on the same map, which already kind of leads to difficulties in that regard, as if there were any changes for Joust, probably any Duel player would be pissed if they don't get the same changes. But that's not all. Joust is also not regarded very highly by most players, and it is not regarded very highly by hires themselves. When they made the part of the SPL last split, where no SPL was actually played, instead we had the summer Joust tournament, they very specifically said that they're not taking that very seriously, and actually some of the casters had some fun with those games rather than commentating about them seriously as well. As such, there is clearly a perspective from Hi-Rez that a lot of them think that 3v3 Joust is not a main mode, not one of the modes that should get a lot of attention. Could this be changed? Yes, potentially it could be changed. But what would be the implications and benefits? You would have a massive amount of work going into this balance, which will probably already upset people playing other modes saying that those are not balanced enough. And it would also mean that all these changes have to be tested over multiple instances. Then it would probably lead to shifting metas, and those would have to be readjusted. We would not have enough of a sufficient player base of people that really could show if something is properly adjusted or not, because we don't have the same SPL or anything for 3v3 Joust. We can't really see how the changes affect the game on a high level. And we would end up with something that is probably not much more balanced than what we currently have. So why Conquest? Conquest is basically the game mode why Smite can brand itself as a MOBA. If it didn't have that game mode, people would be at some kind of action shooter mix thing. They would probably not consider it a MOBA in the traditional sense, because in many ways it is already very different from a traditional MOBA, and that is just the main part that stays. You still have the 5 people, you buy items, you go into your lane, you clear your minions, and you push down structures. As such, Conquest is probably what gives Smite legitimacy as a game that has a competitive scene. All of the competitive involvement is revolving around Conquest and Conquest only. All the pro players play in Conquest, all the sponsors sponsor teams that play in Conquest, everything else, everything that's around the SPL, around those events, everything that's advertised, everything that involves other companies and revenue is focused on Conquest. Conquest also has the slowest XP spooling out of all modes and the slowest gold spooling, which makes for easier balance. If you try to balance for a game mode that's significantly shorter and, for example, where late game gods just come online very quickly, you will have a lot more problems because there are a lot more implications into how that could be very complex and very risky, especially for the game mode itself, and easily overbuff certain characters compared to others. It's very hard already to balance for a laning phase that includes 2 characters like the duo lane in Conquest. If you do the same for a laning phase with 3 characters, including everyone in Joust, you're gonna have issues finding out who's gonna clear how, and then if we buff one character, would he have too much clear in comparison to that character with that character, and 3 gods in the same place just make that very hard, especially when pretty much any god can be picked anywhere at any point. In that context, it's also worth pointing out that the changes to Twisted Treeline are primarily pretty minor. For example, somebody like Vamana would have a little bit of a weaker ultimate, because it's more designed against 5 players, and overall the changes wouldn't be that drastic as many people expect them to be. What people often think would happen if there was a drastic balance change is that pretty much every god would end up in A tier, everyone would be balanced. And that is exactly not what's gonna happen. Instead, there will just be new gods climbing to the top. If you remove certain very strong gods from a game mode, or make them a lot weaker, then other gods will be there instead. That's the same thing with duel and having more bans. So if we were to remove Ares from Arena, then maybe, for example, the next god could be Xing Tian that gets picked a lot because he's got a big CC or something like that. It doesn't really matter which god would be the next one, it's just an example here, but you get the general idea. The other very big issue that many people completely don't factor in is balance changes. The game would obviously keep on developing and changing over time, especially regarding Conquest, and as such, many items would be changed, many gods would be changed, new gods would be introduced, and so on. And if Hi-Rez was to balance all those game modes accordingly, then they would have to balance every change for every god accordingly as well, and they would have to adjust every new god release for the according maps as well. There are maps that are played enough to justify this just from a number of player perspective, but once again, those are not the competitive ones. And if the change happened there, then you would hit the next brick wall. If Arena gets their own balance, for example, to target Ares, then why the hell would Clash not? And if Clash gets their own balance, then why the hell would Joust not, and so on. And you have this problem where every player that is in a game mode that's not Conquest would basically feel treated unfairly until their specific game mode is balanced against the others as well. And like I said, with every patch this would be completely overhauled and all these game modes would have to be rebalanced. Smite mainly has a lot of casual fun modes, and Hi-Rez treats them as such, and I think they should probably be seen as such. They don't think that any mode out of Conquest is actually competitive, and therefore the balance will be remaining around that mode, and probably around that mode only. Hopefully that explains this question in all detail. Tell me in the comments down below what you think about this. Thank you guys very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell. It really helps me out. See you for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.